What I want to do in this lesson is talk about conservative economics, the kind of economic theories and economic ideas that have been proposed by conservative thinkers and conservative ideologies over the years. We're going to begin by talking about sort of the general areas of agreement that most conservatives would argue are, you know, where there is the most agreement in terms of key economic concepts, and then we'll talk about the areas where there's little bits of disagreement, because conservative ideology, just like socialism, liberalism, and anarchism, have all changed over the years, and there have been key different thinkers that have come in and developed them further. So, as an introduction, the economic principles of conservatism have changed dramatically over the years, over history. So we know this already. We know that conservative ideology has changed and shifted to fit different periods of time and to fit different narratives. So the first issue that we should talk about is the issue of private property, the extent to which private property is moral or immoral, or should be allowed or should not be allowed within a conservative system. Conservatives overall are in general agreement for the existence of private property. According to a conservative thinking, the existence of private property is almost like the extension of the individual. So the individual can be described as not only the person, the body that they inhabit, but also the property that they own. Therefore, individuals ought to be protected, and if individuals ought to be protected, so too should their property. That's the general gist of the concept of private property. And most conservatives agree with this. Most conservatives will come to an agreement that private property ought to be something that is protected to the greatest extent possible, and that restrictions on private property would limit individual freedom. Now, this is where we get into some disagreements, because to one extent, private property doesn't just exist, doesn't just relate to the land, but also the ownership of things that they have. And some people take this argument of private property being restrictions on private property being a restriction on individual freedom, and they take it to a libertarian perspective. So libertarian perspective, and we have things like taxation being described as theft. Taxation is theft being quite a libertarian framework, and getting to the point where if your private property should be protected insofar as possible, that the state should not be able to infringe in whatsoever in any kind of way on individual freedoms. A second point we need to talk about is the existence of capitalism. So, since conservatives have a general view of human nature, that is, that people are generally selfish, okay, that people are generally self-centered, people are really looking for their own aspirations, okay, they would support a capitalist system. Don't forget that Hobbes, one of the key thinkers before conservatism, Hobbes described human nature as nasty, brutish, and short. So that's how he described a state of nature. So, and this played into Hobbes' understanding of how human nature works. People are selfish, people are nasty and brutish, and this would cause life within the state of nature to be nasty, brutish, and short. So therefore, a support of capitalism is something that makes sense. Now, this is not to say that, you know, to give any kind of anti-capitalist undertones in this lesson, but what I'm saying is that people's views of human nature, the idea that a human nature is that somebody may be selfish, that's not necessarily a pejorative thing. It's just that people tend to think for themselves and have their own self-interest in mind when they're talking about when they're thinking about human nature, when they're thinking about making decisions. And so therefore a support of capitalism makes sense, because capitalism is the most effective way to generate private wealth. To generate private wealth, you want to be able to do such a thing, and as such conservatives will support the accumulation of wealth under a capitalist system. Now really that's where the support of capitalism, that's where the agreement among conservatives ends in terms of support of capitalism, because we have different kinds of, to what extent should we support capitalism, and how and what kind of capitalism should we be looking at. So a more moderate conservative may support capitalism while accepting that some restrictions may be placed for the promotion of equity and equality. So, for example, you might support capitalism, but you might also support the existence of a welfare state to an extent, and that the welfare state may have to be paid for using taxation. So an individual may be able to accumulate wealth and be as wealthy as they wish, but they might have to be taxed on that wealth, and that tax may be useful to provide health services and police services and other kind of welfare programs for people who are less well off. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, conservatives, some conservatives believe that a complete free market is the way to solve all of these problems, and a lack of intervention of the state. There shouldn't be any intervention of the state. That the free market, let the money flow where it should. Now this gets us into a number of issues when it comes to the different types of areas of disagreement among conservative thinkers. So Hobbes, again, don't forget, not a conservative. Not a conservative, however, played and influenced conservative thinking quite heavily. Hobbes argued that the existence of the sovereign was something that was essential to the working of the economy. So Hobbes would actually disagree with more modern conservatives who believe that the free market is the most sacred aspect of the economy and it should be left without intervention from the state. Hobbes would disagree with that proposal and would argue that no, the sovereign is essential to the workings of the economy. On the other hand, one of the earlier thinkers of conservative thought, Edmund Burke, placed a greater emphasis on the existence of private property. So Burke focused more on private property and said that this extends the importance of the state to protect the existence of private property. So rather than having a system of limited state, Burke believed that the state should exist and should have powers, but those powers should be to protect private property. He believed that an alleviation of poverty and inequality could be and should be achieved by private charity and not public welfare. So he believed that we should be able to, poverty and inequality are still important issues, but he believed that in order to solve these issues, we need to be looking at private charity organisations rather than public welfare programs. Traditional conservatives would arguably have the most moderate position in terms of the way in which it operates today. These conservatives support capitalism, so a general support of capitalism, while accepting the limitations of capitalism. They support the existence of maybe even a mixed economy, where we have privatized industries, but we also have nationalized industries. And in some cases would go even so far to support protectionism rather than free trade. To what extent should protectionism be supported? They support the existence of capitalism, but recognise that when capitalism is unregulated, it can lead to a number of issues like gross inequality and a gross hoarding of wealth at the top end of the spectrum. The New Right would disagree with this support of a mixed system of some regulations on capitalism. These are the greatest supporters of the free market, people like Nozick and Ayn Rand. They would argue that the state should not be able to intervene in the economy. Okay, and it suggests to an extent a libertarian position. However, a libertarian position is a little bit more extreme than that of the New Right, because a libertarian position takes this position that the state shouldn't intervene in the economy and goes one step further and says that A, the state may not even should possibly not even exist at all, and B, the state shouldn't be allowed to even take any percentage of my private property. So not even £1 worth of taxation, because taxation apparently is the same as theft, according to a libertarian. Some New Right thinkers support the cutting of taxation and a trickle-down economic system. So the idea of trickle-down economics is quite a Thatcherite and Reagan theory of economics, is that if we want to have more money spread across the economy, spread across the entire society, wealthy and poor, we should cut taxation to the very wealthiest. The very wealthiest would then have will have more money, that they can then spend on a number of different things, and that eventually that wealth, that money, should trickle down to people who are lower down in terms of economic prosperity. Now, one of the problems with trickle-down economics is it doesn't account for the rate of savings relating to the people who are wealthier and higher up on the economy. So if you are more wealthy, you are more likely to save your money because you have more money at hand, and that money is then not used in the economy. Whereas people who are lower down in the economy, people who are much poorer, tend to have less saving, and they have to spend most of the money that they get, and therefore that money travels around an economy more and more. So that's one key flaw with the trickle-down system of economics. However, it was one that was supported by the likes of Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s. Robert Nozick, to finish off, Robert Nozick was somebody who was against the existence of the welfare state. Robert Nozick famously wrote the book Anarchy, State, Utopia. Anarchy, State, Utopia. And he believed that the welfare state could be compared to the existence of forced labor, because according to Nozick, because individuals are forced to work and to pay taxes, and those taxes are then used to pay for the resources of others within the welfare state, it's almost like we are forcing these people to to use their labor to create resources for other people, and that's why he was against the existence of the welfare state. So as we can see, when it comes to economic theory and economic examples, conservative thought tends to disagree a lot internally. There tends to be a lot of disagreements when it comes to different conservatives and different positions within conservatism. However, most agree on a number of key issues. So for one, the existence and support of capitalism, and two, the existence and support of private property.